Okay, I think we'll make a start. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for everyone who's joined. Obviously, to our panelists and to all our attendees. And you should start receiving content now. So, once again, welcome. This is the BCO Urban Affairs Group webinar. So, it's the first event that the BCO Urban Affairs Group has been doing in this new normal through the medium of Zoom. And the theme today, as you know, is the future of cities in the age of AI. I'm Cristiano Testi. I'm a Principal Director at TP Bennett, and I'm also the Chair of the Urban Affairs Group within the BCO. And we're extremely lucky to have a fantastic panel of experts joining us today to bring this fascinating topic to life. Our panel today is Andrew Baum, who's Professor of Practice at Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. Andrew is a specialist in real estate investment and management, and has held a number of previous roles within academia, for example, at the University of Cambridge, and also outside academia for institutions such as CBRE. Simon Giles is Managing Director UK and International at Tyréns, and Simon previously led the Global Cities practice at Accenture, looking at how, amongst other things, how technology makes cities better places to live and to be. Michael Hurwitz is Director of Transport Innovation at at Transport for London, TfL, and his responsibility and role is to make sure that transport is functioning and ready for the future. And before working at TfL, Michael was Head of Environment Policy and Delivery at the Department for Transport. And concluding our panel, we have Annabel Koeck, who's an Associate at Grimshaw Architects. Annabel's probably known to a number of you as one of the winners of the 2017 BCO Office of the Future competition, with an absolutely stunning entry. And Annabel studied with her architecture in Sydney at the University of Sydney, and was previously working in Sydney with Woods Bagot. In terms of the format and a little bit of housekeeping, I would ask that everyone who isn't speaking obviously goes on mute. There is a mode through Zoom to ask questions. Obviously, I would very much welcome questions from the audience, and I'll field them to our panel of experts at the end of the session. We will have presentations and contributions from our four panelists in the first part of the webinar, and then the second half will be opened to a panel discussion between our group and open to questions from the audience. And we will bring this to a prompt close at 3 o'clock to enable everyone to go to their inevitable next meeting or Zoom call. So without further ado, could ask Camelia, who's driving this, to go to the next slide. And it's my great pleasure to kick this off by welcoming Andrew Baum to give us his insight. Over to you, and thank you, Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Happy to introduce this webinar and to keep this very, very brief. I'm going to do whatever I can in 5 minutes to get a couple of key messages out of the way. Bearing in mind that I come from this as a real estate finance and investment person, not as an urbanist, but I do have some interest in technology and how that's developing and how it's going to affect buildings and cities. So next slide, Camelia, please. Everybody is talking about smart buildings, smart real estate and smart cities. I think it's fair to say that a lot of work's going into creating smart buildings, and there's good progress being made and good reason for that. Smart cities, in my mind, are a long way away, and the reason they're a long way away is because there's a financing problem. I think anybody who's tried to navigate their way across a small UK town or city using public transport, particularly buses, would realise how unsmart most places are, and we haven't got the techniques in place or the technology in place to make cities particularly smart. And the reason is because there is this financing problem. Cities are a mix of public and private goods. What used to be public is now partly private. Since the privatisations of the 1980s, budgets have been hit, subcontracting has been standardised, and the result is that we have fragmented ownership across cities. And then you get the question, who pays for the spaces between buildings? If you look at a shopping centre, then there is one owner of a shopping centre responsible for all the common parts, charges a service charge to make sure he's got a vested interest in promoting the shopping centre. There's no analogy in the urban setting because the city government doesn't have the same sort of control over the entire urban environment because all the buildings are subcontracted and owned by other people. Who pays for transport, waste and energy infrastructure is a continuing problem. And it gets onto the next issue. Next slide, please, Camelia. What makes a city investable? You know, what cities attract capital and why do they attract capital? Well, the ones that attract capital are the big places, because investors don't like to spend too much time researching small opportunities. So big cities become interesting with the good economic base, so the right employment structure. Investors need liquidity, so they need to know that they can sell their assets. So there's a sort of a vicious circle. If you're an uninvestable city, then you'll continue to be an uninvestable city. And I think that then the two key points for our topic today, Chris, is that number one, people need transparency, data and intelligence in order to put money into places. And the second thing they need is a belief that you've got infrastructure, in particular transport, health and education. And I talked about this vicious virtuous circle. Next slide, please, Camelia. So if we'll go on to transparency, data and intelligence, everybody's talking about AI or deep learning or machine learning. And this next slide, Camelia, tells us that I'm assuming that on this panel, we're not going to be too technically accurate about distinguishing between machine learning, deep learning and AI. It's probably enough to know that people will probably argue with you if you talk about AI and ask whether you mean deep learning, machine learning or whatever, or just maths or just computing. Next slide, please. So we're doing some work at Oxford on applying data to location decision making, and there are lots of businesses out there that are trying to assemble lots of data about cities using mobile phone data, for example. Next slide, please. And if we go into the infrastructure piece, then what is it that makes cities interesting and how can we use AI in cities? Just a couple of examples. If we look at the next slide, here's a piece of real estate behind King's Cross Station and St Pancras Station. What made that a special place? Why was it that a lot of money was put into the backlands of what was previously a very unattractive area of London? What was it that made it special? There's a really simple answer to that. Next slide, please. Hopefully that shows it. What makes King's Cross special is the fact that 6 underground lines converge at that place. And in addition to that, you've got at least 3 railway lines, including Eurostar. Next slide. Canary Wharf's exactly the same. What made Canary Wharf move from being a potential white elephant to being a success is the introduction of the Jubilee line. So transport infrastructure is absolutely crucial. If you're a real estate investor, you need to be able to understand the impact of infrastructure and transportation in particular on the value of the real estate that you are buying, building or renting. And data then becomes the important question. So how do we use AI? What do we use it for? Next couple of slides, or the next slide, will tell us that we can scrape data from a variety of public sites, Airbnb, Google Maps, TripAdvisor, Booking.com. We can get comments about the popularity of restaurants, cafes. We can pick up passenger pedestrian flows from transport interchanges, and we can start to build up a pretty rich data set to help people make location decisions. Next slide, please. So here's a slide from my data scientist at Oxford. He's doing some work on, would you believe, ice cream parlors in Berlin, and trying to work out the optimal location for an ice cream parlor in Berlin. And he's using that sort of data from TripAdvisor, from the transport infrastructure system, passenger traffic coming from the transport interchanges, and so on. So my last slide. My conclusion, my key messages is that smart cities need good data, they need good transport infrastructure, that real estate investors can help fund the infrastructure, and there's a lot of technology investment going into the data. But the fundamental problem that we're left with is that cities are not smart, that in order to create smart cities, you need a lot of money coming from a variety of organizations. And I think one of the open questions that we should be discussing is who is going to drive this development of a smart city? Is it governments? Is it monopolies? You know, do we want a Facebook for urban real estate? Is it going to be institutions like the BCO, or is it going to be individuals? And I think that's one of the topics, no doubt, that Chris will lead us into. That's it from me, Chris.
Thank you very, very much, Andrew. That was beautifully delivered in what I do accept as a very, very short time. leading us into the next chunk of this webinar is Simon. Simon, if I could please hand over to you to give us your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Andrew, for the introduction. So when I approached the question, I was thinking about it as a practitioner. So what are the key questions that my clients have tended to ask me over the years, specifically in relation to AI? But when we look at AI, it's often conflated amongst a whole host of other technologies, and my clients don't tend to be that good at distinguishing between the various different technological components. So there's a lot of conflation between AI, big data, analytics, even IoT, and all the other technologies that come within that ecosystem. And I think the challenge there is we really do need to be pretty clear about answering kind of the four questions. The first is, what is it? What is AI and what can it do for me? The second is, does it really add value? Like, if I'm going to invest pounds in this, how's it going to return value to me as a real estate investor or as a city manager? The third question is generally, is it safe? Is this something I really want to invest in, or is this going to get me into a world of trouble downstream? And that is a really critical question. And the third is, okay, this sounds really complicated. Who really understands this, and what kind of team do I need to build? Because I probably don't have the competencies in-house to be able to harness AI. Now, what I would say is that there are lots of things that AI can do, but that generally the sort of tasks that we see it being applied in, and it's out there in the big wide world right now being used very regularly, even within our cities and within our buildings, it tends to perform certain types of functions quite well. So if we talk about the first two types of the four types, which is probably the narrow AI that we all experience on a day-to-day basis, we tend to see that it's very good at doing specific types of tasks. Optimized problem solving, making sure that a system is optimized across a whole series of parameters. The second is pattern recognition, identifying patterns in data and being able to give me some insight into what's happening. The third is kind of understanding human behavior and profiling. How do I understand who somebody is and what type of behavior they're going to elicit next? And the third is then kind of taking that to the next level and doing things like voice recognition and facial recognition. So using pattern recognition and diagnostics to understand kind of people's behavior within a built environment context. Now, all of those are very, very valuable tasks, but they get applied in different ways, and they require a certain type of hardware, software, and data to be able to perform those tasks. So then actually the key question to ask is, well, if I've got all these tools in my locker, how do I actually create value as a real estate investor, or as a building manager, or even as a city manager? And that's where things tend to fall down, because we tend to have this kind of barrier within the industry between technologists, urbanists, and financial consultants and engineers. And it's very rare that the dialogue across the different disciplines tends to work effectively. And when it comes to really articulating what the value proposition is, you need to understand what the use case is for the technology, and then be able to translate the use case into real world benefits. And the reason that we've seen a lot of AI being done at the test level or at the prototyping stage, but not reaching real wide adoption, and this applies into smart technologies more broadly as well, is a failure to articulate how these technologies are going to add value, how they're going to affect people in the real world. And in order to do that, you need people that can bridge the gap between understanding the technology, understanding the urban context and the behavioral context within which they're operating, but also being able to translate that into a business case. Because at the end of the day, the people that are going to fund this need to understand how this is going to return an investment to them when they invest their money. The third question was about safety. And I think this is the really critical one, actually, because when we're dealing with these types of technologies and the data that we're talking about, there are all sorts of questions associated with data privacy, data veracity, so the accuracy of the data sets that you're using, but also the ethics of the coding that sits behind the AI. Because the reality is most of the AI is developed in coding, or the parameters are set by individuals, and the coding represents all the biases that are inherent in the people that are doing the coding, or even the background bias that exists. And you only have to look at the news today. I think I just saw a headline this morning saying that IBM was going to be pulling out of the facial recognition business because of their concerns about racial profiling, right? Now, I think you're trying to understand where we're dealing with powerful technologies like AI, dealing with human behavioral assessment, trying to deliberately profile and identify using facial recognition software. We need to think very carefully about data ethics and the ethics of AI. And actually, one of the challenges we have is that our institutions of government aren't really that well set up to be able to manage the ethics of AI. And there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done behind the scenes to get everyone comfortable with the management of the data, the cybersecurity, the data privacy, and the data ethics and managing the institutions. So in terms of who really understands it, I guess the key here is if you're going to work on AI and you're a client that is looking to get support, try and get the blend of skills, the blend of technologists, designers, engineers, and business consultants, people who understand the value, and create an interdisciplinary team that is able to blend all of those skills to make sure that you don't get into trouble, you can implement it effectively, and it delivers the value that you need.
That's great. Many thanks, Simon, for your contribution. Michael, if I could invite you to tell us next what you think the opportunities and challenges are, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me along today. I wanted to make 3 points, hopefully in the next 5 minutes. You know, I'm the guy with innovation in my job title, so by definition, I'm going to be a believer in the opportunities of technology and opportunities with AI. But 2 of those points are actually constraints and limits. I will finish with opportunities now where I think we can go, but I wanted to start by making the following 2 points. The first, and as Simon was saying, AI covers a range of issues. Andrew was saying there's many interpretations of it. And there are limits to how far you can go, particularly in a mobility context, in a transport context. When you start to talk about deep applications of AI, that means decisions, judgments, trade-offs being taken by systems when it comes to control. So that could be network control systems or driverless cars. There is still this fundamental challenge, and it falls to regulators and the ethicists at the moment to determine how safe is safe enough, how unbiased is unbiased enough. And those are really, really big issues. So the first thing I would say, the first constraint is don't jump the whole way to deep AI. There's a risk in looking at AI that you go for the moonshots, you go for the driverless car, for the flying taxi or whatever, and you miss the incremental opportunities of applications of these technologies on the way. So the first constraint I wanted to say is that really deep AI can be problematic, but don't necessarily shoot for that first. The second constraint I wanted to say is that there's always a risk in this area of the couldn't you just approach to problem solving. There's a sense that if you throw technology at an issue, it will be resolvable. But sometimes, particularly when it comes to the challenges of mobility in a city, the basics of economics and the basics of physics are actually the most important consideration, particularly now in a COVID world. You know, the economics of transport have been blown apart. It used to be about getting as many people efficiently on the network as we possibly can. Now we're trying to put on as many services as we can to keep them as empty as we can to encourage social distancing. And the economics of that are just not sustainable under any way that you could cut that. And the fact is that you can't always throw technology at a problem or AI at a problem to solve it. You know, we're really concerned in London right now to not have restart and recovery happen in a way that locks us into a car-based recovery. And yes, we can nudge and we can take great insight from the data of how people are moving around the city. But sometimes just nudging people one way has its limits. And sometimes the best thing is, well, do you know what? We just need to create more space. We actually need to take non-technological interventions to create a structure that can lead to effectiveness. So the second point I wanted to say is that technology isn't always the solution. Sometimes it's the basics of how do you design space What choices do you give in terms of physical infrastructure? And you start there because that defines the parameters within which AI has to operate. So if those are some constraints, where do I think there is genuinely an opportunity in the buildings context, in the mobility context, to support that, where AI could present quite new, exciting possibilities? The first is the integration and the electrification of the transport network with the built environment. And I think that when you think through the many challenges of electrifying the transport system, of course, by the way, I should say, is Transport for London, we want people to be active first, right? You know, and if you're not going to be active, we'd like you to get public transport, not at the moment. But you know, we do still accept that there will be a lot of vehicles traveling around the city to make it function effectively. But we want to maximize the environmental performance of those, and electrification is key to that. And thinking through what is needed to make that work, it will be a combination of smart charging, clever use of energy storage, of very sophisticated scheduling of who is charging when, how you actually create access and schedule access to the limited charging infrastructure. I think there's a real opportunity there for the integration of smart systems that are very hard to do if it's taken each of those one by one. So the integration, smart charging, integration of energy and infrastructure, I think, is one opportunity. And the second opportunity, and this again has really been emphasized as we see a post-COVID world, is last mile logistics, deliveries, freight and servicing. Because the society we know is already becoming more dependent on delivery, on last mile delivery. And the way we can integrate that to reduce road danger, congestion, pollution, actually facilitate the smooth flow of goods as well as people, I think therein is space for real-time analytics, real-time trade-offs, real-time understanding of how we can manage scheduling in response to what's happening on the network. I think freight servicing, and particularly if you're thinking about the design of new buildings, how do you get that movement of goods as well as people in and out? So there we go. That's my point. There are some constraints with AI, but I'm actually quite excited about its application in the future, and particularly in two areas of electrification and then freight and last mile delivery.
Very good. Many thanks, Michael. Before I hand over to Annabel, just a point to the audience. If you do have any questions that have been sort of stimulated by the contributions of our last three speakers, or indeed what we're going to hear from Annabel very shortly, do feed them through. We will have a Q&A session between the panelists at the end, but if there are any burning topics that you would like one of our expert panelists' opinion on, please do feed them through the Zoom questions platform, so we can ask them at the end. And without further ado, Annabel, if you would like to share your thoughts and your presentation on this topic, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So next slide. So we know that 6.5 billion people are going to be located in cities in the next 3 decades. That's a statistic from the United Nations, which is 68% of the global population. And we're looking at ways that AI can use data to more efficiently direct resources in cities. So next slide. This slide shows where we are with smart cities at the moment. So cities are messy places. We've heard they're a mix of privatized utilities, legacy infrastructures, and these ingredients make it really hard to digitize existing infrastructure. So what's so far been delivered in smart cities are sort of basic prototypes of smart tech and Internet of Things objects like smart parking, smart bins telling you when to collect them and in what order would be most efficient, smart lights, sensors to monitor the environment, microclimates to have the biggest impact with, say, street trees. An example in Toronto was the proposal of a parking app called Flow, which wasn't just about helping you find an empty parking space, but it also introduces a pricing model that lowers the cost of parking for people who've had to travel further and penalizes those who probably should have walked. So next slide. Looking forward, I've noted 3 ways AI will be impacting our cities. So in terms of robotics, AI will continue to have a large impact on movement in cities. So robotic services are already being used in Milton Keynes and will only reinforce the need for more accessible cities for the movement impaired. So accessibility is really moving to the top of the agenda in city developments in order to enable robotics in the urban realm. Interestingly, in cities on the smaller scale, delivery companies have been experimenting with AI to determine delivery routes. And we already know that AI often comes to conclusions that we would think are illogical. So for example, they have delivery drivers zigzagging all over the city as the fastest route rather than area by area. That comes back to what some of the other speakers have mentioned about accountability of decision making when we already have AI coming up with solutions that perhaps seem illogical to human intelligence. Also, 1/3 of UK councils already use algorithmic systems to make welfare decisions. There are assisted robots being used in social welfare homes. Next slide. In terms of machine learning, so we expect to see this continue to evolve in current directions within the built environment. So machine learning is what most of us are really familiar with today. So for example, facial recognition. Interestingly, the Met recently did a study and found it was in the UK currently 19% accurate. We're also seeing the invention of things like floor sensor data that can be implemented in the public realm, that can identify individuals by their walking gait, Wi-Fi to detect movement, and is becoming person specific. And also under management, facilities management. So Arup, for example, have started looking at programs that look at satellite imagery, scanning areas, identifying hazards, cross-referencing property locations, services, and determining the best way forward. In terms of roads, that's quite a simple one, sort of automatic signage, making a decision on sort of based on a lot of the information around it, around congestion and road accidents, on things like changing speeds. Public transport, so we are seeing a decentralized workforce. Obviously coronavirus is having an impact on that, but also we're already seeing migration out of cities like London into secondary cities. So with that happening, sort of looking at the ways AI will impact services on demand, changing routes, optimizing some of that information. Next slide. So in terms of how AI can better support urban planners, local councils, and city design, which is what I'm quite interested in, we see the exponentially increasing scale of modern cities. It's beyond the perceptual capacity of most people to develop a good knowledge about the qualities of the urban space across their entire city. So AI provides a new set of tools to understand the detailed workings of the urban realm. So new headsets, body sensors can measure gaze, beating hearts, the state of nervous systems as people react to certain spaces around them. And using these sensors, we can assess the quality of urban environment on a large scale. So we suddenly have hard data to back up design interventions, and AI can be applied to better understand patterns in people's responses. So for example, will there be design elements identified by AI that we haven't correlated before as positively impacting the urban environment once AI is assessing 1 million different people's reactions as they pass through different spaces in the city? Just as we've spoken about illogical driver routes, perhaps there are some other illogical ingredients to successful public space. I don't know, for example, traffic jams and noise to create a sense of busyness in public space. So this image is a before and after of a major roadworks in Bristol with the implementation of a huge roundabout, and it shows the impact of decision making in cities when it's led solely by hard data. So for example, highways and transport information. And the lack of information, we've traditionally had to rebut such arguments when it comes to spaces for people. So in master planning, AI gives planners and urban designers a new tool to determine, for example, volume of buildings, set out of new build plots, setbacks, because we can now use analytics to actively design to some of the more subjective qualities of city by using some of these headsets and measuring sensors as people experience place. So next slide. So the MIT Media Lab have collated a large set of data on people's perceptions of safety along streets. So for example, you can see in the images here, and that feeds a machine learning algorithm, which can then assess on a large city scale, often using Google Maps, where the areas that require investment in our built environment are. So that's just one example of an application of AI in city planning. So next slide. So real world observations using smartphones and physiological sensors will give the discipline of urban design and master planning a new basis for decision making at an urban scale, which is traditionally quite a complex scale beyond individuals' sort of imagined sensory capabilities when we're talking at the scale of a city. And we can now explore our reactions to city simulations at a fine-grained level. And that brings together everything from street trees to massing to street width, a whole number of factors. And we can now see how they all come together to impact our experience of place. So next slide. So finally, we can't discuss AI without discussing some of the risks. I know they've been mentioned today quite a bit. The largest being that we're allowing the way we disregard privacy on the web to follow us into the physical world. So these technologies aren't under our control, and there aren't privacy policies that we can choose to accept or reject, like on the internet. So do I have a choice when I step into public space, and what happens to my data? So also another key question that has certainly come up during coronavirus again. I know in Australia, there was an Australian tracking app, and the key question is, where is the data hosted? So often with facial recognition software, if that's stored on servers, if those servers, for example, are in the US, actually the US government can access that information and citizens' data. So they're big questions when we're talking about, for example, facial recognition at King's Cross. In terms of accountability, we've already mentioned that we already don't understand some more simple AI decision making, such as in delivery routes. So applying that to health or transport infrastructure is very risky. And bias has also been mentioned. We're only as good as the data that we input. So we really risk embedding and amplifying discrimination in everyday public sector practice. And finally, in terms of development, for example, with Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, data was a part of the financial model between the city and developer. So that raises some really key questions of who owns private citizens' data. So next slide. So in conclusion, AI can impact the built environment in a myriad of ways, from the way we design to the physical environment, from accessibility to understanding microclimates. And the property industry needs to recognize that AI is no longer the remit of security and IT departments. We certainly have a role to play in determining how we apply AI in our cities. And I think an apt comment is that we don't go to construction companies first and say, what do you think we should build on this site? And likewise, we should not let AI and technology vendors write or drive our policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And well, firstly, I must applaud all of our panelists for admirably keeping to time. This is obviously a hugely complex and multifaceted topic. I think today we've done extremely well, so thank you again. I think we've covered the tip of the iceberg, and it's a fascinating iceberg it is. I'd like to start, obviously, to open our sort of panel discussion with a couple of questions. And there's a few recurring themes that have come through the various contributions and the various points you raised. I mean, the strapline for this event was futuristic utopia or Orwellian nightmare, and I think it sounds like that there's certainly scope for both, and it's interesting to see how we navigate and ensure that it's the former rather than the latter. If I go back to the beginning, I'd like to invite Andrew to answer my first question, which is, and it's a question which you sort of ended with, is one of the biggest challenges, which also Annabel touched on with the Sidewalk Labs example, is how do we balance the conflict potentially between private and public? How do we avoid a situation which could lead to public anger, where there's, I suppose a public funding of the investment, but then a privatization of the benefits and the profits? How do we balance those two sort of potentially opposing, but ideally interacting forces, so that it really is a benefit of the common good for people, for creating new markets, and for the public and private side of society?
It's difficult to express a view about that without entering into a political position. And I think if you believe that democracy is the right form of government, then it's difficult to argue against the role of benign government being the correct way to approach this. And Sidewalk Labs is interesting. I mean, Sidewalk Labs dropped its Toronto project partly because of political objections, about the role of Alphabet in dominating, data. So we have a view in our Oxford Future of Real Estate initiative. We've developed this view that you need a benign interlocking of the public institutions and government, and you need them to be dominant in order that the private businesses that contribute to the system are under some sort of control and divided and ruled effectively, because it would be so easy to create a data monopoly. We can see that AI leads to efficiencies, it leads to a natural monopoly. Once one person gets a leadership position with data, then their products are inevitably going to be superior to everybody else's, so that they get more and more data because more and more people subscribe. So it just becomes a vicious circle where you just fuel a monopoly. So to some extent, you have to have governments involved in this through regulation. But I think the way that they're really going to get there is through institutions like the BCO, like organisations of professional people, acting as a brake or an encouraging lever, if you like, on the private businesses that they represent.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I could see Simon nodding, so I'd like to invite Simon to sort of respond and build on what you've just said, Andrew, and also just add a couple of other points for you, Simon. You like many of us in this panel sort of spoke about data and ethics, and clearly the approach and the philosophy around data and ethics varies hugely globally, right? So depending on what jurisdiction or what culture you are in, and we've seen this with different countries, very varied approaches to how we manage, track and trace and coronavirus. Is there a risk that we fall behind other countries who have a slightly more, slightly bolder approach to privacy, data and ethics? Or actually, should we be safeguarding the values that we hold dear as a society? Where do we strike that balance between innovation and driving technology forward, but without sacrificing the aspects around privacy and data protection that we value as a society?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely endorse Andrew's comments. I mean, the role of NGOs and government in setting the regulatory and ethical and legal environment within which this has to operate is clearly the way forward. I think, there are roles for, as Andrew said, the BCO and other NGOs to form a role that balances the needs of the private sector with the needs of the individual and the needs of communities within which they're operating. And I think this has to be represented by multiple different stakeholders and needs to reflect kind of the political environment within which we're operating. And clearly that differs around the world, and we choose to live and operate in a certain environment, and there are challenges and benefits to operating in that context. And we will see more rapid developments in all sorts of different technologies in different environments on the basis of the ethics within which, the ethical context within which they're operating. I think Sidewalk Labs is a really good example of where maybe there was a misread of public sentiment and political sentiment, and I think that's the real challenge. Understanding the politics and political behaviour is, in my experience of operating as a technologist in this space, the biggest downfall. people don't understand the realpolitik of how to operate in this type of environment. And whether it's smart technologies, the use of IoT within the smart city context, or whether it's the application of AI, the reality is that these technologies can become very toxic very fast for politicians. And as a consequence, they tend to have very, very conservative approaches to the way in which they're going to endorse it. And the reality is that they will happily talk about the benefits and the utopian opportunities associated with technology, and may even fund prototyping and initial research of that process. But when push comes to shove and larger investments have to be made out of the public purse into whatever form of technology we're talking about, politicians tend to get relatively shy. And I think a large part of that is a misunderstanding from the industry side of the realpolitik, the constraints that they operate under, and being able to address and communicate those concerns, whether it is an understanding of community concerns around data privacy or embedded bias within the process, but also being clear about how, as a group of industry participants, we're going to try and work around that process and address it head on. And that is the real challenge here, is that it takes institutions like the BCO and other NGOs to bring together the different actors within the process and facilitate the development of the frameworks in which we operate. But we mustn't forget, the technology is developing faster than our institutions are evolving. And therefore we have to take an active role as industry participants in trying to get ahead and keep up with the technology evolution, so that it allows these technologies to be adopted faster.
Thank you very much, Simon. We obviously, I think leads us quite nicely on to Michael. And obviously, Michael, you've got your past career and your current role are working in public institutions, public bodies. From your perspective, what are the sort of challenges that you've encountered in terms of realpolitik and in terms of balancing innovation with the realities, the commercial, the political, the community and social realities of a complex society? So I guess what would be the challenge that you would encounter or would warn against? And specifically talking about community, how do we build community consensus around what inevitably does have some real benefits for society and for people as a whole, that also has some very sort of attracted a lot of suspicion, particularly around the data point? How can we bring people on board, and what's the role of government and public departments in doing that?
Yeah, well, let me start I'll start in reverse. How do you bring the consensus around it? TfL, I guess, in contrast to some of the pictures that Andrew was painting earlier on, we are uniquely kind of unified and integrated in ways that many other parts of the country aren't. It's still not perfect, but we do have a unusually broad sphere of influence and control. So I guess what I'm about to say is easier for us, but particularly when it comes to data, our customers, through a lot of research, we know that they trust us to be neutral transactors of data, and that when we do things, they more or less trust us to do the right thing by the city overall. So my colleagues have started tracking movements of people by looking at Wi-Fi usage across the tube network. And the way we did that, we did a trial. We communicated very freely, very openly about it. We're very strong on how we're going to be protecting privacy, very open about how we were going to be using that data. And it's all about improving flow, improving signage, reducing danger, reducing crowding. So we were very, very clear and open with people. And then through trialing it relatively rapidly, and then presenting what insight that can show, you quite rapidly are able to kind of prove that taking a step forward is in the collective societal citywide benefit. So I guess that's the question about approaches for taking steps towards using data more, and it's just being, you know, open and transparent and having clear goals. But you asked through various bits of, you know, my personal experience. You know, I think that there's a deal to be done. You know, so for me as the city authority now, I have a legal duty to make sure that what we do in London and what we encourage in London works for everyone. Yeah, so new technology can be great, but it's not great if it only works for a you know, an affluent, tech-savvy hipster who lives in Shoreditch. It has to work equally as well and provide equally as much opportunity for you if you're one of the 15 to 20% of the people that don't use mobile data in London. It has to be equally applicable to you, irrespective of race, age, gender, you know, all forms of inclusion. So we have a duty to push that forwards. And in the Mayor's Transport Strategy, if you want to read it, it's Policy 23. We wrote out the lenses through which we will look at new opportunities, new innovations. You know, so I like it when it leads to better use of the limited space we have on the streets. I like it less if it leads to things becoming crowded. You know, I like it if it, I guess this is the old world, you know, but if what you're doing is taking people out of active modes and putting them into individual cars, that's not an effective way of doing it. Yeah, I don't like it if we have a new, you know, e-scooters is a very current issue. You know, it could present opportunities for some people, but I don't want them to provide issues for the less able or the visually impaired and cluttering up pavements and creating new forms of road danger. So there is a version, you know, there's a heavenly version of the innovative future and a hellish one, but I think there's a deal. And which is more or less as follows: is that traditionally, particularly for the, I guess, for the startup world that tends to originate out of, you know, out of California, there is this desire to go for those network effects of getting the scale and dominating a market. And there's a deal to say, look, I'll let you try, and I won't set the regulations too quickly because that can be a shackles to innovation if it's done in certain ways. You know. But in return, don't come at scale, and then we can work out what the right balance of regulatory structure can be that can both allow us as the city authority to uphold the needs of the public, but also provide a viable commercial opportunity for those people trying to launch new services and products. And I think that's it for me. It's that ability to have that conversation about where you strike the balance, and frankly, that is a key role for representative organisations such as BCO to say, right, these are the terms of the deal. You know, what are you prepared to give to make sure that it works for both of us? That's kind of hard for us to do on a one-on-one basis. And I think there's a real role for representative organisations to tell us how we can strike that balance between sensible constraints, but also providing commercial opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. It seems to certainly echo what Andrew said in response to my first question. So before we open, there is a question from the audience. But before we move to that, obviously cities are, you know, built and designed by planners, architects, engineers, contractors. They're physical environments. And as the architect on the panel, you know, Annabel, obviously there's a tension between, you know, particularly in a historic city with like London, with a very dense and complex and layered urban fabric. There's obviously the opportunities in sort of ex novo cities that are maybe more a reality in sort of emerging markets. From your perspective as a design professional and someone who very much as with Grimshaw, you blend transport and architecture and where the two worlds collide. Where do you think our industry potentially has got it wrong, and how do you think, if indeed we need to rethink the approach? Maybe not got it wrong was the wrong way to explain it, but is there a new philosophical approach to how we plan and design cities that needs to become a new normal if smart cities are to become not only a reality in the future, but a positive one?
Really tricky question, because I think we're still at a point where we're trying to understand a lot of the technologies that are available to us. You know, we're still very much experimenting. You know, we've mentioned sort of the failure of the Sidewalk Labs development. We're just starting to look at sort of lessons learned from, we now have those projects so that we can better understand what went wrong. And I think a big part of that was, if you look at that RFP, setting your goals from the outset is just critical, even if you're not quite sure how you might implement them. That RFP mentioned nothing about data and such elements. In terms of what we could do better, I guess we're both on a building scale and a city scale, we've gone past that element of this new online digital economy. We all understand data and the risks associated with it, but also the opportunities. And I think we are at a point where we are seeing a younger generation who've seen a myriad of privacies being siphoned away through the internet. We're all now a bit more sensible. We're seeing a lot more investment go into privacy in developments and in cities. So a really simple example is the popularity of a phone. It's called the punked phone, and people pay a huge amount of money for it. And it's actually a very dumb phone. It's the complete opposite of an Apple iPhone, but we're starting to see that shift. And I think that's somewhere that in the sort of architectural and city planning world, we're starting to reckon with being much more conscious of what are we enabling in our city and in our public spaces, particularly on a privacy front in terms of design. But also I think there's that classic question of, is modernity making us lonelier? So sociologists, technology changes, but sociologists constantly have the same question about loneliness. And interestingly, there've been a lot of studies recently comparing sort of a lot of city planning analysis from, say, the 70s in New York City, William White, all those studies with today's urban realm. And actually, they've shown that people spend more time in public spaces. People spend more time in groups. There's more women in public spaces. So I would actually say it's easy to sort of look at a lot of the negatives, but even accounting for technology, actually public space is only becoming more successful. And these studies show we're not getting lonelier as tech gets bigger. So I think we're certainly moving in the right direction.
Great. Thank you very much for that. We do have a question from the audience. William Walker, thanks for asking the question. Should individual building infrastructure owners get paid for sharing their data with those who manage and manipulate it? And in our private chat, Andrew makes a very good point. It's a good question, but do building owners own the data? And Annabel, I can see you started framing a response around privacy, and perhaps you could just expand to that. So the question is, should individual building and infrastructure owners get paid for sharing the data? Andrew's challenge is, good question, do they own the data in the first place? Is it theirs to sell? Annabel, what's your view to bring us to a close?
So I completely agree that it's, it potentially isn't theirs to sell, and do we even want to encourage that kind of economy? And I just, again, was talking about privacy, and that we're seeing privacy come onto the agenda of a lot of organizations as a service in commercial development. And, we're already even seeing Apple selling privacy as a reason to go with Apple iPhones. It's very big on the market now as we understand data, and it's also, in terms of clients we work with, it's certainly making their way onto their agenda for their developments. So people are, I guess, foreseeing the risk that building owners may misuse their data, and people are starting to counter that.
Andrew, anything to add in a final minute before I bring this to a close? Just
one of the interesting dynamics which is going on in the office market right now is the difference between the building owner, the building operator, and the examples offered up by the hospitality industry, which thinks about its business as B2C, B2B platform. The building owner doesn't think that way at all. They've got a lease contract for 15 years which separates them from the customer. And so it's you've got to understand the intermediaries and the building operators, which makes WeWork so interesting as a business model.
Well, and I'll just comment in terms of WeWork, you know, we see them, or they previously, a couple of years ago, buying up IT companies. So, you know, the big question is when you're in WeWork, you know, when you're using their internet, what kind of, you know, I would go to WeWork and say, you must have more information than anyone else about startups across the world. You have that data. And I don't know what small companies sign away when they agree to work in a WeWork. And WeWork is potentially a development company that is actually, when you look behind the scenes, an IT company.
Yeah.
Which is a very good point, which is like everyone said McDonald's isn't a hamburger company, but they're a real estate investor. And the same that, you know, everyone would argue every bank, every accountant, every company now is a tech company masquerading as something else. And on that note, we've got 2 minutes left, and I'm conscious people might want to grab a cup of tea before their next meeting, which leads me to say a huge round of applause and to thanks for Annabel, Simon, Michael, and Andrew. Thank you as ever to Camellia and Arazu and everyone at the BCO for supporting us in bringing this event together, and for everyone, of course, in the audience who's dedicated their time. Hopefully it's been an interesting hour for you in the midst of a sort of grim and rainy afternoon. For any sort of follow-up queries, do follow up with the BCO directly. We'll be happy, obviously, to answer any other questions and to see if there's, obviously, this is a huge topic that I think we will be, as our panelists have indicated, one that the BCO, I think, has a real role in developing and exploring further. This recording will be available on the BCO website for members, if you, in case you missed parts of it. But from now, from everyone in the BCO and in the panel, thank you very much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.